From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
He was elected a decade ago to the Senate in 2002. He serves on the committees on health, education, labor, and pensions. We are extraordinarily grateful to this very busy, distinguished, respected, and I might add, musically gifted senator for rearranging his travel schedule so that he could be here. We very much look forward to his remarks. We thank him for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Lamar Alexander.
Thanks, Jim. Ladies and gentlemen. I think I see my friend Dick Riley down in the front row. I want to say hello to him. We served together as governors and worked on education for many years. I know I was invited today because, having been one, I can empathize with university presidents. On my first day as president of the University of Tennessee, a faculty member came up to me. I was filled with enthusiasm, and she noticed that, and she said, "Oh, Mr. Alexander," he said, "you remind me of Clark Kerr." Well, I was very complimented to be put in the same league with the distinguished former president of the University of California. And so I said, "Well, thank you. How is that?" She said, "Well, you know, he arrived and left the same way, fired with enthusiasm." So that was my first day as a university president. And then often people will come up to me and say, "What's harder, serving as governor of your state or serving in the president's cabinet or being a university president?" My answer invariably is, obviously, you have never been a university president or you wouldn't ask a question like that. Your jobs are very difficult, those of you who lead land-grant universities and other colleges and universities, but so much of the future depends upon your strong leadership. I was very pleased when my friend Mitch Daniels, the governor of Indiana, was invited to be the president of Purdue University. He's a strong leader. That's a great university. It ought to be a remarkably good match. We're here today to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the creation of the land-grant universities and of the National Academy of Sciences, and at the same time to throw a bouquet to Andrew Carnegie for creating so many free public libraries. So the question is, what in the world was in the water in Washington, D.C. in 1862 and 1863, 150 years ago? During the 2 years just after the telegraph dispatched the Pony Express in 1861, Congress and the President enacted the Morrill Act, creating land-grant colleges, authorized the Transcontinental Railroad and the National Academy of Sciences, as well as the Homestead Act. They agreed on a conscription law with teeth, a national banking act establishing a national currency, and an internal revenue law, and they created the Department of Agriculture. Now, if I were the Republican national chairman, I might suggest that this transforming burst of governing was simply a matter of turning the entire government over to Republicans and sending home half the Democrats, because that's about what happened. By the end of the 37th Congress in 1863, Southern Democratic United States senators could not obstruct any of these laws because their states had seceded from the Union and they weren't allowed to vote. According to the Senate historian who was busy counting this morning, just as I was coming over here, at the end of that 37th Congress, there were left 48 senators to vote. 27 were Republicans, 12 were Democrats, and 9 were an assortment of unionists, oppositionists, and know-nothings. Or perhaps the wonderful environment then was created by simply the energy of a brand new political party, or the brilliance of the new president, Lincoln, or that Congress in those days was much more efficient than it is today. The Morrill Act that became law passed both the House and the Senate in the same week in June of 1862. The National Academy of Sciences Act was introduced in February of 1863. It passed the Senate and the House and was signed by the president all on the same day about 2 weeks later, March the 3rd. In those days, presidents would obligingly travel down Pennsylvania Avenue and sit in the Capitol on the last day of the session and wait for legislators to bring him their bills to sign. Or maybe the good environment for transforming legislation was the absence of 24-hour media and of special interest groups and of instant communication on the internet. Or maybe it was that members of Congress had more time to think great thoughts without being interrupted while traveling to sessions. It took Senator Sam Houston 6 weeks to travel from Texas to Washington for a session of the United States Senate. And no doubt it helped that there was a crisis, a civil war. Americans have always risen to our best, it seems, during a crisis. And making the crisis worse, many considered the new president incompetent. In January of 1863, right in the middle of this period we're talking about, former Supreme Court Justice Benjamin R. Curtis said, quote, reported general agreement on the utter incompetence of the president. He is shattered, dazed, and utterly foolish. This is from David Herbert Donald's book, Lincoln. The editor of the Cincinnati commercial wrote that the president was, quote, an awful, woeful ass. If Lincoln was not a damn fool, we could get along yet, unquote. And the president, in turn, considered many of his generals incompetent. And he and Mrs. Lincoln were suffering personal crisis, grieving the death of their son, Willie. The war crisis clearly did help enact the transforming legislation that we celebrate. One impetus for passage of the law creating land-grant colleges was military training. Among the first assignments of the National Academy of Sciences was to find some way to protect iron hulls of Union Navy warships from corrosion. General Grenville Dodge told President Lincoln that the Transcontinental Railroad was a military necessity, although Representative Justin Morrill, who was a visionary in other ways, said he saw no need for the railroad to go beyond the Nevada silver mines because it would only be traveling through uninhabited territory. And the war caused the bickering Republicans remaining in Congress to pull together. The editor of the Chicago Tribune explained, quote, if we fail, then all is lost. Union, party, cause, freedom, and the abolition of slavery. Let us first get the ship out of the breakers and then court-martial the officers if they deserve it. So it helped to have a crisis. Unfortunately, the formula for the passage of transforming legislation 150 years ago is not so neatly explained as a crisis plus a brilliant president plus a high-minded Congress efficiently enacting big ideas developed in Washington. The real story is much more American than that. As has usually been the case, these big American ideas came from outside Washington. They took a long time in coming, and enacting them into law was a long and messy process. Jonathan Baldwin Turner's address before Illinois teachers in 1850 proposed the creation of an industrial university 12 years before the enactment of the Morrill Act. Representative Morrill first introduced his legislation in 1857. It passed after much struggle in 1859. President Buchanan promptly vetoed it. 2 years later, Morrill succeeded. And even though the obstructionist Southerners were gone, Eastern and Western Republicans argued vigorously over land grants and where the new Transcontinental Railroad ought to go. The roots of the National Academy of Sciences can be traced to a group of Cambridge scientists meeting in the 1850s, or to earlier philosophical organizations, or even to Benjamin Franklin. And California entrepreneurs, speculators, politicians, some of them were all three, were the ones who persisted during the decade of the 1850s until the Pacific Railroad Act was law in 1862. So the formula for success for those transforming laws 150 years ago was typically American. Big ideas bubbling up from around the country, plus entrepreneurial persistence, plus a crisis. All that equaled transforming results. Now, how does that formula apply today to improving the American condition? Well, to begin with, we have a handy crisis. Washington is borrowing 40 cents of every dollar it spends. At this rate, by 2025, every penny of federal tax revenue will go for Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on the debt, leaving nothing, unless more is borrowed, for the national defense, national laboratories, national parks, research, or education. A second crisis many fear is that our country isn't up to the challenge of competing in a future of surging Asian economies. So what transforming steps must the United States take today to meet those challenges? Well, my own view is that rather than creating new institutions, as Americans did in the 1850s and 60s, we would be wiser to spend our time making the institutions we have work. Let me give just two examples. First, our basic governmental institutions. The new Foreign Minister of Australia, Bob Carr, a great friend of our country, has said, quote, "The United States is one budget away from reasserting its preeminence in the world," unquote. He means, of course, that the world is watching, actually hoping that at the end of the year, the United States will demonstrate that we can actually govern ourselves by resolving the fiscal mess we have in a way that reforms taxes, controls spending, and reduces debt. To do this, we don't need a new form of government. We need for our newly elected president, whether his name be Romney or Obama, to lead. President Johnson's press secretary, George Reedy, once defined presidential leadership as one, seeing an urgent need, two, developing a strategy to meet the need, and three, persuading at least half the people that you're right. And we don't need to change the rules of the United States Senate. We simply need to have a change of behavior. More focus, less focus on playing games, more focus on getting results. The new Congress, whether it be a Republican Congress or a Democratic Congress, must make its goal to dispute, amend, debate, and vote, even change on the president's proposed agenda, and then to help the president succeed, because if the president succeeds, our country succeeds. We might well remember the words of the Chicago Tribune editorial writer in 1862, quote, "Let us first get the ship out of the breakers, then court-martial the officers if they deserve it." The second institutions we ought to refurbish and make work are our colleges and universities, not just our land-grant universities, but all 6,000 of our higher education institutions. Again, we don't need new institutions. We simply need to reassert the greatness of the ones that we have. Our universities, along with our national laboratories, are our secret weapon for innovation. And innovation is America's secret weapon for producing still 25% of all the money in the world each year for just 5% of the world's population. The list of what it would take to strengthen our colleges and universities is short and mostly agreed upon. First, stop sending home every year 17,000 of the 50,000 international students who graduate from U.S. universities with advanced degrees in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Give them a green card, let them create jobs in the United States. Next, double funding for advanced research, as the America Competes Act already has authorized. Third, repeal the federal Medicaid mandates that force states to spend money on Medicaid that otherwise would be going to higher education. This has resulted over the years in dramatic decreases in state support for higher education and increases in tuition to try to maintain quality. Next, while Congress is repealing the Medicaid mandates, it should literally cut in half the stack of other regulations that hamper institutional autonomy and waste dollars that should be spent on students and research. And finally, the institutions themselves should look for ways to save money, such as full utilization of facilities during the summer, 3-year degrees for some students, reforms in tenure. In the 1960s, Mitt Romney's father, George Romney, offered the following advice to the big 3 Detroit car manufacturers. He said, "Nothing is more vulnerable than entrenched success. Nothing's more vulnerable than entrenched success. The big three did not pay attention to that advice, and you see what happened. It's good advice today for universities. Now, in conclusion, a word about the Carnegie libraries. My experience is that most ideas fail for lack of the idea. Or to put it positively, that a great ideal eventually carries itself into reality. Andrew Carnegie's great idea was building free public libraries. All of us know of their importance. Once, when I was campaigning, the New York Times wrote, Mr. Alexander grew up in a lower middle-class family on the edge of the Tennessee mountains. When I called home later that week to talk with my mother, I found she was reading Thessalonians to gather strength for what she considered to be a slur on the family. Son, she said, we never thought of ourselves that way. You had a library card from the day you were 3 and a music lesson from the day you were 4. You had everything you needed that was important. Andrew Carnegie's gift and the federal laws creating land-grant universities and the Academy of Sciences and the Transcontinental Railroad and the Homestead Act all have this in common. They were not command and control federal government actions from Washington. They were big ideas that, when implemented, empowered Americans to do things for themselves, to travel, to own a home, to educate themselves, and to learn by using a library. For example, my empowered mother took me to the A.K. Harper Memorial Library in Maryville, Tennessee when I was 3 years old in order to get my library card. Mrs. Alexander, the librarian, said, we don't give library cards to 3-year-olds. Well, you should, she said, and they did. So on this anniversary of congressional enactment of transforming and empowering ideas, there should be more hope than despair. We still have most of the world's great universities. They still attract most of the brightest students from everywhere, insourcing brain power and creating wealth. According to a recent Harvard School of Business survey of 10,000 of its alumni on U.S. competitiveness, if you're in business in our country, it's still hard to beat America's entrepreneurial environment, proximity to customers, low level of corruption, access to skilled labor, safety for people and property, and protection of intellectual property. We have a remarkable system of government created by geniuses that most countries struggle to emulate. So, why not celebrate this anniversary by taking steps to make our institutions work, to ensure that 25 or 50 or 100 years from now, we have even more of the greatest universities in the world. And as our friend, the Australian Foreign Minister, has suggested, why not take advantage of our opportunity at the end of the year to enact a budget that restores and reasserts America's preeminence in the world? Thank you. Now, I'm told there might be questions or outbursts or criticism or whatever, and if anyone has one, I'll stay for a few minutes, Vartan, whatever you and Jim would like for me to do. Well, I'll be at the back of the room, and if you have any answers, I'd like to have those. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Lamar Alexander. We chose him because he's the only one who was professor of history, president of University of Tennessee, governor of Tennessee, senator from Tennessee, secretary of education, and we thought he needed to be here so he can believe he can combine all of those attributes and positions. And I'm delighted to tell you that he believes everything he said. So that's wonderful, because One of my first shocks in the United States was when Senator Pell gave me a congressional record. As a historian, I thought that record represents everything accurately what is said in Congress. I did not know that before they gave their speeches, congressmen and senators say, I lack the right to revise my remarks and update them, and so forth. So I was very shocked at the time. But when it comes to Lamar Alexander, he does not edit, because as an educator, he's always consistent. So thank you, Senator. Today's last session is about Andrew Carnegie and the public library system. I have to tell you, this was not my idea. It was Jim's idea, my friend Jim's idea, because he thought land-grant universities were about the setting of a university where the people are. Then they needed laboratory, hence National Academy of Sciences, and then they needed also library. So Jim put these three things together, the university, the laboratory, and the library, how they complemented each other. And the other thing is that libraries don't have graduation ceremonies. That's the only institution nobody graduates from. That's the first and only continuing education institution that was established in the United States. And many individuals of all the time that I've met in very funny settings, including one Supreme Court gathering when Supreme Court Justice Thomas was so excited to see my title, President of Carnegie Corporation. He came and took me aside, said, you know, I'm educated only because a librarian let me in off hours in Mississippi to Carnegie Library. That's where I was given my chance to be educated. And then I said, well, would you care to write it down? So he wrote on the spot a letter and asked me to print it, which we published it in Carnegie Reporter to show. And this situation goes everywhere. Even people that don't have Carnegie libraries, they have a library, they think it must be Carnegie Library. So they always approach me in trains and planes and so forth. I enjoyed your library very much. Then, of course, the other thing which we did not put today, and that was absolutely deliberate, because Andrew Carnegie also gave 7,000 organs for churches and some synagogues, because he thought ministers can kill spiritual zest, but music can uplift them, so that way. So here is a remarkable person, very busy, but he believed in democracy, and he believed in the republic. He wrote actually a great volume in praise of triumphant democracy about America. So today we have four, let me see, 1, 2, 3, well, I include Jim also, librarians here, and I'm a former librarian. We're here to discuss the libraries. And Jim, of course, will be the first one to say the position of Library of Congress as the guardian of not only our nation's memory and heritage, but humanities. You'll be surprised to know how many small nations have this library as their repository of their memories in the world. Actually, thanks to PL 40, whereby we gave wheat or sold wheat to India and Pakistan and Bangladesh later and others, we could not use their currency, take it out. We could buy things there, and more periodicals were bought in this entire South Asia continent with that money, and most of it came here and other depository libraries. As a result, some of the best collections of Indian literature and Indonesian, all of this are here because of PL 480. So, and Jim is the guardian of it. And the last phase that Jim has started, I hope you'll have a chance to talk about it, is World Digital Library, which has been his passion here. So with that, I'd like my colleague and friend with whom I have worked for many years, Jim Billington, to express our gratitude for hosting all of us. And this program was his idea, even though he blames me or attributes to me. But it's his idea. We're glad to be at his home and for him to discuss Library of Congress for a couple of minutes, then we'll go out with librarians.
Thank you very much. If you need a short definition for, I was going to say as he was running through those accomplishments of Lamar Alexander, I was thinking of the long list of things that we could attribute to Vartan. He has certainly been a dynamic force in the intellectual life and energizer, and we're very fortunate to have him as a sort of co-convener and in many ways the inspiring agenda setter of this conference, as you are to a large extent for the nation. So Vartan, thank you. Now let me just say that like any large library, research library, the Library of Congress is a guardian of memory that has the threefold, and they all have the threefold mission simply of acquiring, preserving, and making accessible human knowledge and creativity. This library is unique in three basic ways. First, it is America's oldest federal cultural institution, too old to have a board of governors, except the Joint Committee of Congress, which is the oldest committee of the Congress that contains members of both houses. It's been funded also by annual direct appropriations from the Congress of the United States, which has been on a consistent basis, on a bipartisan basis, through good times and bad, the largest patron of a library in the history of the world. Second, the Library of Congress became, in the century between the 1870s and the 1970s, the largest and most varied institutional collector, preserver, and curator anywhere of the world's recorded knowledge in multilingual, multimedial formats, and also the closest thing we have to a mint record of the diverse cultural and intellectual creativity of the American people, thanks largely to being the sole custodian of America's copyright deposit. To have nearly 7 million pieces of sheet music, just for instance, is probably more than the rest of the world has produced. Finally, and perhaps most important of all, the library has evolved in the century and a half since its burning of the original collection during the War of 1812. It's become, as all libraries in America, I think, aspire to be, maximally accessible and useful to its core constituencies. In our case, here at the heart of the Capitol, the library has two basic and enduring service obligations, each requiring structural support very different from the other, yet both deeply interconnected and equally essential for sustaining America's knowledge-based democracy, which is the theme, of course, of our conference. The library's first and highest priority service mission is to provide the very specific needs of the Congress for objective, dependable, and historically grounded knowledge in order to perform its two basic tasks, making laws and overseeing their implementation. This is provided exclusively by the Library of Congress' Congressional Research Service, which is in fact the largest think tank in the world, though also the most invisible because it has only one client, the Congress itself, and also the Law Library of Congress, which is the largest library of its kind. Now, the second core mission of the Library of Congress is to serve the American people, which is far more diffuse and difficult to define than serving Congress itself, but equally important, and the main preoccupation of by far our largest service unit, namely what is to a large extent the de facto National Library of the United States. Now, it's unique features of our democracy that the same enormous fund of knowledge that is freely and easily made, or relatively easily made accessible to our elected officials, has been made equally available to those who elect them. Long before our states were united, our independence gained, a national government formed, our citizenry set out on the long, and before our citizenry set out on the long road to full inclusiveness, our forefathers created small, private, and local libraries. They began realizing in the use of knowledge what Lincoln had prescribed at Gettysburg for the exercise of power, that Governance, you remember, to be legitimate and sustainable must be of the people, by the people, and for the people, and must not be allowed to perish from the earth. I think one of the most moving moments I've had as Librarian of Congress was to see the future Emperor of Japan, our erstwhile bitter enemy, fight back tears as he read stoically to himself in a barely audible whisper those closing words from the reading copy in Lincoln's handwriting of the Gettysburg Address. Now, in summary briefly how the library has expanded its service in the last 2 decades, I would stress this is the result of bottom-up hard work by an extraordinarily dedicated, long-serving, and multi-talented staff, exponentially expanding the range of our unchanging mission in changing times, despite having lost 1,300 members of this staff since 1992, the last year before we launched ourselves into the exploding digital world. Recent innovations can be roughly described as responses to 2 basic challenges, which I identified for the Library of Congress when I was sworn in 25 years ago, taking it both out more broadly and in more deeply. We've gone in more deeply by sustaining and expanding our capacity to serve as a more efficient and accessible guardian of memory. We brought into being 4 new physical facilities beyond the 3 on Capitol Hill. There are modules at Fort Meade, Maryland now for paper-based material preservation, and in Culpeper, Virginia for audio-visual preservation. We also have 2 new remodeling projects here on Capitol Hill, which represent substantial library subsidies to people, scholars and teachers who want to visit library, but can't because it's become such a very, very expensive city. One is our Kluge Center for Scholars here in this building, the flagship building. The other is the transformation of nearby, which is a convenient and usable place for scholars to work and be, in effect, subsidized and helped considerably. The other is the transformation of a former school complex into a affordable temporary residence for scholars, teachers, and interns who want to come and use these resources but simply can't afford it. In helping bring more scholars, and for that matter, teachers and interns to Washington to mine the massive memory bank here, we emphasize the very young, the very senior, and humanistic perspectives that can bring a little bit of Greece into Rome. And we have created a unique international award that follows many of the selection procedures and matches the $1 million level of Nobel Prize to dramatize here on Capitol Hill the importance of humanistic scholarship broadly understood. We will present it next month to Fernando Henrique Cardoso, the great transformative president of Brazil, but who was at the same time probably the greatest social scientist in Latin America in the late 20th century before he went on to this important work. Now, the library has gone out more broadly by placing online high-resolution copies of many important, interesting, and often one-of-a-kind primary documents of history and culture. 34.5 million items about the United States with clear, accurate, dependable explanations by curators in our 17-year-old National Digital Library American Memory Project. More recently, we have created, with UNESCO backing, a World Digital Library, which is a novel and promising new vehicle, I think, for better transnational understanding of the cultural underpinnings of other nations. It presents on a single website, single metadata, digitized world treasures from the Library of Congress. More than half of our books are in other languages other than English here, as well as multiple treasures that are pouring in now from many of the 145 institutions worldwide from 75 countries who are partners in the effect and together with us are preparing expert curatorial explanations in 7 languages. So Americans are taking the lead in what you might call virtual repatriation of cultural memory to foreign countries, which increasingly tend to see us as cultural imperialists driven by a materialistic and licentious commercialism. They want our goods, of course, but they deeply resent, in ways we're only beginning to understand, the way we congratulate ourselves, for instance, on multiculturalism at home, while we are in effect undermining it abroad with our massive communications in instant and audiovisual form. In this age of instant interconnected communication, the 45% of internet users who are under 25 and many more involved in the social media are getting into the act irreversibly. This very small but rapidly growing World Digital Library is bringing scholars and curators from different parts, for instance, of the Arab and Chinese-speaking worlds, together with American counterparts to discuss what to put online that best represents their traditional culture. Spanish language usage is significantly greater than English, and this is indeed an exciting win-win project for promoting peaceful cultural coexistence in our contentiously global world. So I hope that many more American institutions and philanthropies will have the fun of participating in it and help us find the relatively small funds needed to sustain this project and the amazingly small central staff that is making it work, headed by Dr. Van Undaren, who also played a big role in organizing this conference from the library's side. Now, 17 years of wide classroom usage has shown us that primary documents can motivate both teachers and students to climb higher up the ladder of learning. Even students in the lower grades of elementary school can be brought onto the lower rungs of the ladder. They may not understand the full meaning of the primary documents they see on the screen, but they will be stimulated to find answers very often to the questions that they pose themselves, which will lead them into reading, rather than to drift back into the tedium of memorizing the answers already provided by someone else. The peaceful pursuit of knowledge will help keep them from the pugilistic pursuit of one another. In the difficult budgetary times that we lie ahead for all libraries, I foresee that the Library of Congress will be working more extensively with other libraries and with other institutions and networks like those represented here, the land grants and other universities that we are especially honoring. We will also have to be binding together internally our digital and analog resources so that we will be able to provide in the future rapid but comprehensive one-stop shopping for knowledge by our core constituencies of Congress and the American people. And for what it's worth, in conclusion, I believe that the digital will continue to supplement but will never supplant the analog. It never can, because there always have to be human intermediaries and humanistic base to whatever we say. Anyhow, supplementing rather than supplanting is the way technological change has happened in America. Movies did not supplant plays. Television did not supplant radio. We are a people who tend to add without subtracting when we bring in new ideas, new immigrants, new recipes, new ways of doing things. Even more important for the survival of books are two simple facts about our country. Our independent and representative form of government were rooted in the values of the book culture. And we are the only world-spanning civilization. This is what Henry Commager told me in his last visit to the library, and I have never forgotten it. We are the only world-spanning civilization that has been created and sustained entirely in the age of print. It is not at all clear that the nation which developed under the longest-running written constitution in modern history would be able to sustain its dynamism or our knowledge-based democracy if we became completely dependent on endless digits on some perishable substance or up in a cloud. Our grandchildren may never know that our hallowed word liberty is founded and derived from the Latin word for book. Long before the advent of the internet, my predecessor, Dan Boorstin, said, "You will be able to get all the information you want from a computer, but only from a book will you be able to form the unimagined question and accept the unwelcome answer." Thank you very much.
From James Billington, I learned two other factoids, as you call it. One was that Library of Congress has more literature in German published in the United States than any other institution. That's not very much used in the United States. So those of you who want fellowship to use the German collection,
German American.
German American, that's why I say published. You have a room to do that here. The second thing that I learned from Jim was the fact that all the major librarians here have been historians so far. And that's a bias we all have. Historian, 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 professor, historian, historian. As a matter of fact, the greatest resentment of historians have been traditional librarians, because they always say, why do you don't give any librarian, real librarian? You always give historians, 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 Harvard historian, New York Public Library historian, Library of Congress historian. I said, because they're guardians of history and historical knowledge. And that's one of the reasons we are here. So before I ask my friend here, I'd like to thank David Nasaw, a great historian, the biographer of Andrew Carnegie, because he was doing his proofreading of his latest manuscript. He said, do I have to come? I said, absolutely. So he's here while in his mind counting which footnotes he has to delete or add. But it will not interfere with his presentation. So I'm very grateful to you, David.
Thank you.
For coming despite all the obstacles that you faced.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, despite my hesitations in the beginning. The place to begin is with the sheer scope and scale of the gift. During his lifetime, Andrew Carnegie gave 1,419 grants at a cost of $41 million, several billion dollars today, for 1,689 public libraries in the continental United States, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. 160 library buildings were built in Indiana alone, 142 in California, 106 in Illinois, Ohio, New York, 101 in Iowa. From Honolulu, which got its grant in 1909, to Devil's Lake, North Dakota, which got its in 1908. From Holton, Maine, 1903, to Santa Rosa, California, 1902, the national cityscape would by 1919 be marked with stately, sturdy Carnegie libraries. An additional $15 million built 660 more libraries in Britain and Ireland, 125 in Canada, 17 in New Zealand, 12 in South Africa, and similar numbers in the West Indies, Australia, Tasmania, the Seychelles, Mauritius, and Fiji. But the dollars tell only one part of the story. From my perspective, the least important part. More important, then and now, is why Carnegie gave his gifts and what he wanted to accomplish with them. Andrew Carnegie was that rare combination of dreamer and doer, of utopian in his ends and pragmatist in his means. He was also a self-made man and the product of a rags-to-riches journey, the only one of the robber barons who began with nothing and ended the richest man in the world before he started giving away his money and ceding that title to John D. Rockefeller. Carnegie believed in education, but not much in high schools and colleges, which were inaccessible for boys like him and the masses of young Americans and women, American men and women in the early 20th century. He did not expect the nation's high schools and colleges to provide the masses of Americans with the education they required. And that is why he gave so much to libraries. The library was, to his mind, the quintessential educational institution for the whole community. Men, women, children, the underemployed, the unemployed, the strivers, the upwardly mobile. He believed in upward mobility, in a meritocracy of talent and discipline, in the Spencerian notion that the fittest would survive and thrive in a new world where there were no government impediments, where there was no establishment of blood and family, no aristocracy to hold back the ambitious and talented. Andrew Carnegie, in short, believed in the American dream of upward mobility, that no one was confined by birth or circumstances or poverty or background to remain in the situation to which he or she had been born, that with grit and discipline and hard work and ambition and innate intelligence, the sky was the limit. What more proof did he need of this than the story of his own upward rise and that of so many of the men he worked alongside of? He belonged to a generation, to a time and place where hope was not something that had to be kept alive, where the American dream was real, where Time magazine would not have to devote a cover story to the American dream because everyone knew what it was. The American dream was the fabric of daily life. He believed, with Herbert Spencer, that human history was ruled by the laws of evolutionary progress, that, as he put it, borrowing from Spencer, things were getting better and better. Progress was assured, that it was in the nature of humanity that today would be spent making for a better tomorrow, for hastening, improving, pushing forward. He dreamed this dream before the horrors of the dark, deadly, violent 20th century came to pass. But it was a dream worth dreaming then, and it is a dream worth dreaming now. The public library was to be the vehicle, the primary vehicle, for pushing forward, for improvement, for progress. It would, he hoped and expected, provide the young, as it had him, with the skills, the knowledge, the information they needed to rise in the world, with the technical journals, the languages, the books about history and geography and scientific inquiry and politics and economics and places near and far. It would provide them with newspapers and opinion journals and literary magazines, and the cultural capital and the intellectual tools they needed to move from being day laborers and haulers and beasts of burden to mechanics and engineers and accountants and managers. The public library would as well provide people with the cultural capital they could not afford on their own, with concerts, lectures, enlightenment. It would become the town center, the secular meeting place, where members of the community would learn from one another, would discuss their problems, would listen to live music, lectures, debates, get news of the world and of other times and places. For the public library to accomplish all of this, and this was indeed a tall order, it had to be free and accessible and open at least 6 days a week, preferably 7, on holidays, from dawn to dusk. And it had to be staffed by knowledgeable, caring professionals, librarians, and volunteers. The agreement Carnegie signed with the New York City government, providing the funds to build 42 branches in Manhattan, the Bronx, and Staten Island, 20 in Brooklyn, only 3 in Queens, and I've never figured that out. But the agreement that the city signed which the mayor and the Board of Aldermen put in writing. They agreed not only to provide the sites for the libraries, but sufficient funding to maintain, repair, staff, and keep them open from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. every day of the week, but Sunday. Because of the blue laws, he would not obligate them to remain open on Sundays, though he dearly hoped they would be. And they would be open on holidays as well, from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., because that was when the people who needed them most could make use of them. Carnegie offered libraries only to communities that pledged sufficient funding to keep them open. His longtime secretary and assistant explained to his first biographer that Carnegie's scheme, quote, and it was a scheme, this is Carnegie's word, a scheme, quote, to get action out of the public authorities, which in the last resort meant the politicians. Carnegie's means was, quote, to offer communities a building on condition that they would fill it with books and tax themselves for its maintenance. I continue the quote. Carnegie himself described this as a bribe to cities and towns to establish libraries. His offer would crystallize public sentiment and force the hands of councils and boards of aldermen. Quote, his real purpose was not to found libraries, but to force the communities to do so. It was high time at the beginning of the last century. It was high time that Americans recognized that libraries were as vital as the schools, the police, fire departments, roadways, sewers, all items that were paid for with taxes. Carnegie would force the communities to ante up the money with his bribes. And it worked. It worked magnificently. It worked then, it can work again. We can learn a great deal from Carnegie's vision, his optimism, his faith in the future that was shattered by the Great War, during and after which he went silent, destroyed by the war that made no sense but that no one could stop. But we do not have the luxury of allowing ourselves to succumb to depression, to hopelessness, to pessimism. We must keep alive the dream that he had. And to do so, to save our libraries, to protect, preserve, expand our libraries, we should use his language. We should emphasize that libraries are not frills, they're not luxuries, but a central component of American education and American democracy. Our schools cannot, by themselves, educate the whole public. They cannot give that whole public the means to educate themselves. Our schools cannot, by themselves, provide the tools by which individuals can lift themselves up, can prepare for new careers, or for advancement in old. They were not intended and are not equipped for lifelong learning. At this moment in our history as a nation, when we question the reality of the American dream, when social mobility appears to have stalled, when higher education institutions too often function to ratify social inequalities rather than disrupt them, we need our libraries more than ever to provide us with the software, the hardware, the books on paper, the journals and newspapers and websites and databases and online courses and language instruction and the concerts and the lectures and the panels and the debates for free. It will not be easy to make the case for the necessity of the public library in our new century, but make it we must. Thank you.
Will be Carla Hayden, Chief Executive Officer of Enoch Pratt Free Library in Baltimore, who has some connection with Andrew Carnegie, and she'll explain why.
Well, I have to tell you though, as you were speaking, and I wanted to jump up, yell, everything, and the first thing I said to David when he sat down was, could you speak to our city council?
Yeah.
I'd like him to speak to the Baltimore City Council. Because you've just really inspired me. And today's celebration, in fact, I sat here in the morning, I found out that I am a product of the 1890 landmark universities at Florida A&M. My dad was teaching there. We're going to lay a wreath at Abraham Lincoln's memorial, and half of my family is buried in Springfield, Illinois, right there with him. And then the Carnegie part has been very inspirational. And so I promised David that I would give him a copy of a book. It's a biography of Enoch Pratt, who the Enoch Pratt Free Library, of course, was named after because he was the benefactor. In this book is a chapter about the relationship between Andrew Carnegie and Enoch Pratt. It wasn't, now I have to also confess that we scoured your book when it came out to find the mention that we so proudly hand out, talk about, and discuss, because Mr. Carnegie, so here is your copy.
Thank you.
With the relevant parts mentioned.
Thank you.
Because Mr. Carnegie actually came to Baltimore before he started and got really going with his giving program. Mr. Pratt was a Unitarian Yankee from Massachusetts who came down to Baltimore and made his fortune with Mr. Peabody and Mr. Hopkins for the Hopkins University. And in 1886, he gave approximately $1 million to the city of Baltimore for what he saw as just one of the institutions to make the city come alive. It was a bustling city, but he also said, when he gave his central library in 4 branches, and also I felt really connected to all the kind of competition between the universities today. The first library system in the United States, we can claim that. Boston was 1950, but it was one central library. He specified, and in Baltimore, which is basically the start of the South, that my library shall be for all, rich or poor, without distinction of race or color. And even today, we have people in the city who talk about the fact that the Pratt Library, or the public library, is the only place that they could go where the races were mingling and they could go together. So in 1890, while serving as a member of the Pan American Conference in Washington, Mr. Carnegie came over to Baltimore as a guest of Enoch Pratt. Now, there's no documentation that we've been able to find of how this friendship developed, but it was reported in the Baltimore paper that Mr. Pratt was full of enthusiasm over his new baby. And he met Mr. Carnegie at the railroad station and drove him around in his carriage. And as the local paper noted, with pardonable pride, Mr. Pratt informed members of the library staff that Mr. Carnegie had come to see his library in order to, quote, get some points for the big library he plans to build in Pittsburgh. And then he said, now show Mr. Carnegie how people get their cards. Well, they obviously had a grand time because the friendship deepened, and Mr. Pratt actually was at the opening of the Allegheny Library with President Harrison. And in Carnegie's essay on philanthropy, The Gospel of Wealth, he actually paid a tribute to Mr. Pratt by stating, many free libraries have been established in this country, but none that I know of with such wisdom as the Pratt Library in Baltimore. This part I have to warn you about. It is safe to say that the 37,000 frequenters of the Pratt Library are of more value to Baltimore, the state, and the country than all the inert, lazy, and hopelessly poor in the whole nation. By placing books within the reach of 37,000 aspiring people, which were anxious to option, Mr. Pratt has done more for the genuine progress of the people than has been done by all the contributions of all the millionaires and rich people to help them to help those who cannot help themselves. And Mr. Carnegie went on to call Mr. Pratt the ideal disciple of the Gospel of Wealth, his famous book. And years later, Mr. Carnegie personally became involved with a gift of $500,000 to the Pratt Library. And he said, it's with unusual pleasure remembering a dear friend, Annie Pratt, whose donation to Baltimore for public libraries was one of the first to come to my attention, and he was my pioneer. So you can see that with Mr. Pratt and Mr. Carnegie, we talk about that all the time, because that the original 14 branches that grant allowed us to have has turned into 21 branches throughout the city with a network. And when you think about the Carnegie program of 1,600 libraries, basically, it's now grown to 16,000, over 16,000 library systems throughout the country. Los Angeles, for instance, County has over 90 branches. New York Public, too many to count.
83.
And as we really like to say, and my colleagues in the American Library Association who are in Anaheim now made me definitely let you know that there are now more public libraries in the United States than McDonald's restaurants.
I'm surprised by that.
I wondered.
I don't think
Now, even though some of the actual Carnegie buildings have been expanded or replaced, the libraries of today, though, are a direct link to what the founder really said at the very beginning, that the public library is the people's university. And today, the libraries remain, especially in the age of technology, the great equalizers. Public libraries today offer, in one of the few places, free, unquestioned access to information and materials to anyone. And I emphasize that. Basically, no one is turned away. Or as a staff member recently said at one of our staff meetings, we were talking about customer service and making sure that you are just as receptive to the woman that came in 2 weeks ago with a live bird. And at the information desk, how to do the reference interview, because she wanted information on where she could take this bird to be helped. She said, and she came on a bus and said, I knew you could help me. As one of the staff members said, and paraphrasing, because librarians are literary, James Joyce in Finnegan's Wake, here comes everybody. And with over 1.4 billion people visiting libraries in this past year, all of the libraries, that's a lot of people, and that's more people than all of the professional sports teams, including the Nationals, have generated in this century. That you have a network of people who are providing services, and now public libraries throughout the nation are the #1 access point for people without internet connections at home or school or at work. We are the place for lifelong learning. We're the places now in the recession that more people are coming to actually fill out their job applications online. 85% roughly is the estimate of the number of jobs that require you to fill out your job application online, including, as one of our librarians found out last week, when she was helping a woman who had difficulty because she wasn't familiar with the computer and she had a language challenge. She was filling out a job application online to be a dishwasher. So all types of jobs require that. So more than 70% of all libraries offer these types of services. And one person recently at the Pratt Library left a note with a $5 donation, which we promptly put in the thing, on the computer in the job center, thanking the staff in the library for, quote, helping me to finally get a job. Now, librarians across the nation are receiving those types of anecdotal instances, and programs have been expanded throughout. We have programs with zoos and museums and all kinds of organizations that help with the basics in life, such as tax assistance, college fairs, flu shots, free performances. All of those wonderful things are going on all over. In Baltimore, for instance, we have a program with branches called the Virtual Supermarket. Now, who thought that you could go to a public library, order your groceries, take a free computer class, and the next day have your groceries delivered? It developed in a partnership with our health department because, unfortunately, our city has a number of what's called food deserts, places in cities, and a lot of times this happens in inner cities where there aren't many good food options. So they tried to find a place in the community that was trusted, that they could trust that the people wouldn't take the groceries, the staff, and that they could have them delivered. And so the virtual library and the virtual supermarket are together. We are facing some challenges. The fiscal aspect, just as more people than ever are using public libraries, we are facing tough economic times, and so that's why that city council presentation would be very good. We also are looking at the library as place. Many of our libraries are going to have more space because of the shrinking need for actual book stacks, and with the electronic I'd say electronic, and some of our librarians are divided on how they feel about the electronic environment. However, it is an opportunity for public libraries to be more than just a place to receive information, but also they could be places where people can create and have creation spaces. And the Chicago Public Library, for instance, has a number of teen labs where young people can come in and they can create their own YouTube things and all that. Also, we are very much involved with social media. I attended a book club, an online book club, where the librarians sat on a panel similar to this in their pajamas. It was for summer reading. It was called Under the Covers or something. And people actually tweeted and twittered and carried on Facebook about their favorite books. We attracted more young people with that type of interaction and book review. We also were looking at the academic libraries in terms of how to use our space and to be more creative, and we have looked at the Harvard University Innovation Labs for libraries. They are allowing their students to design different ways of even having research chairs or different spaces, and it's a really neat lab. I hope you get to talk about that. But it always gets back to the library as a place of opportunity, just like it was for Andrew Carnegie. And so I wanted to leave you with the story. I mentioned that we get testimonials, but I think that one of the most touching was from the playwright August Wilson, who was from Pittsburgh and received the first honorary degree from a public library. Because, as he said, after discovering the books in the Hill District branch of the Pittsburgh Library, he recounted that, and here's a quote, "At the age of 15, betraying all of my mother's hopes for me, I dropped out of school after writing a 20-page paper on Napoleon that the teacher did not believe I had written. I tore it up, put it in his wastebasket, and walked out of school. I did not return. I dropped out of school, but I did not drop out of life. Not wanting my mother to know I was not going to school, I would go to the main branch of the Carnegie Library in Oakland, where they had all of the books in the world. I would stay in the library until it was time to come home from school. I felt suddenly liberated from the constraints of prearranged curriculum that labored through one book in 8 months. Labor historians do not speak well of Andrew Carnegie, but I can say nothing bad about a man who made it possible for me to sit in this library and read. Andrew Carnegie will forever be, for me, that man who made it possible for me to stand here today." And I can say that for all public libraries and librarians. Thank you, Andrew Carnegie. Thank you very much.
The next speaker is someone very special to me because he's now head of the York Public Library, where I had the great opportunity to be there some 8-9 years. I have always considered libraries as stations of hope and stations of knowledge, not just information. Information you can get from your home. So it was very moving for me to be at the New York Public Library in the middle of the social scene at the time when everybody was helping the library. The only check that I did not cash is somewhere in the archives, was somebody's $12 Social Security check. He said, I cannot help give you big money, but this is what I have left. And I can tell you hundreds of stories like that. But the important thing was, and Tony and I agree on this, that library is not given honor by rich people. Library already is classy place. It's library that gives class to rich people. Rich people don't give class to the library. And that was the understanding all the time at the library, that people, by helping it, they're helping themselves to restore their dignity, their citizenship. And the other incident I can tell you, I seldom had a free moment at the library. Actually, I should sue the library for gaining 25, 30, 40 pounds, because you had to have breakfast for donor, city council member, birthday of city council chairman, this, and then luncheon, and then dinner, and before dinner cocktail, after dinner cordials, whatever it is. And I told my wife my clothes were shrinking. She said, no, you're expanding. But other than that, I have nothing bad to say about New York Public Library, because Tony Marx is a scholar, first-rate scholar, president of Amherst past, and then joined the New York Public Library at a very difficult time for the library, because all the things that you said, David, are right, but money is become a main problem, and why New York cannot pass a bond just for the libraries, which they have Colorado, Denver did it in the past, so forth, to have a special revenue. It will pass, in my opinion, with great fanfare even. But Tony Marx is to keep libraries' integrity, libraries' multiple needs, and at the same time to keep all kinds of constituencies happy. So he has 1,100,000 school children in New York that are going to libraries. By the way, Queens, somebody mentioned, the reason there were not many libraries at the Queens, in 19th century, Queens, forgive me if anybody's from Queens, it was designated for cemeteries at the outside. Forgive me. Anyway,
Thank you.
So 1.1 million students in New York. Then you have all the creative talent in New York, artists, designers, publishers, advertisers. All of them are at the New York Public Library going through 1.2 million pictures and others for there. And then naturally, the patent division until recently was not accessible except if you had to visit there. So all these constituents ask only one person, what have you done lately for us? And that's Tony Marx. So he still has the full of enthusiasm, full of commitment and idealism, and we have all to pray for him to succeed. And if anybody can succeed, I'm sure he will succeed. So welcome aboard, Tony Marx.
Thank you, Vartan. So first, let me say it's an honor to join this panel. It's an honor to follow in the magnificent work of Vartan Gregorian at the New York Public Library. It's wonderful to be here in Dr. Billington's own not too shabby library here. And other panelists, David Nasaw, who reminds me frequently and accurately that the New York Public Library is the library of the City University of New York, and whose magnificent biography of Carnegie I recommend to all. And Carla, who is doing the Lord's work in Baltimore, and Bob Darnton, who I'll leave Harvard aside, in addition to his amazing work at Harvard, is a great national and global leader in terms of the question of digital access to the world's information, and is also a colleague and partner of mine as a trustee at the New York Public Library. So it is an honor to be part of this panel. I want to go back just for a second to say it's also an honor to be part of a panel acknowledging the land grant and public universities of this country. I was struck by the senator's opening remarks. It is a powerful, powerful statement that in America's darkest moment, when we were tearing ourselves apart, literally, is when we were also, under the guidance of a great president, building a nation and the institutions that that nation would require. It is in the years of the Civil War, when the land-grant universities are created and the national academies, that the dome over the Capitol building across the street from here was also constructed. Now it's Washington, and we're supposed to stay away from politics. But I'd say sometimes I wonder whether we should maybe take that dome apart to remind those who work in that building of the necessity of keeping the fabric of institutional support of civic society in this country together. David made a comment about the need for all great talent to find educational opportunities, as they do in libraries, but also in the institutions of education. And I can't help but point out the poignancy of celebrating this great anniversary of the public universities of America at a moment in our history when we need those universities and education all the more, and in our great wisdom, we are disinvesting in those precise institutions and in the community colleges which help to feed them. So I think we best remind ourselves of the importance of the dome over the Capitol building and of the civic institutions and educational institutions of this country. Andrew Carnegie's gift that created the libraries, the public libraries of New York, was, by my estimation, I have better historians here on the panel, the single largest act of philanthropy in history. Bill Gates, who will be in the New York Public Library tomorrow, so I will remind him that he still has some work to go. And it's interesting to me, and again, the real historians on the panel will no doubt know better than I, why he chose to do it in the New York Public the way he did. The Astor, Lenox, and Tilden Trusts had created one of the great research libraries of the world. And when Carnegie said, I will cooperate with the city in the way described, he could have done that, I suppose, independently, but instead he said, no, I'm going to add that to one of the great research libraries. In effect, he created, I think in a piece of insight, created a unique combination that brought together, I think, the fourth or fifth largest or greatest research library in the world today with the largest circulating library in America. He built the tensions of that relationship into the institution by creating it that way. As a former college president, the tensions between the research function and the teaching function, I remember those. In a sense, those were built into the fabric of this institution. And people expect that tension to be a destructive one, as if we should pit one side of that operation against the other. And I believe that actually it is that combination that gives the New York Public Library such unbelievable strength and potential, and was the genius of Carnegie's decision of how to invest in the future of New York. Very quickly, what do I mean by that concretely today? I mean, we are envisioning a central library in the main building in New York, you know, the one with the lions in front, that will, for the first time in 40 years, again, have a great public circulating library in it. That building has to be, must be, a great research facility, together with the Library for Performing Arts and the Schomburg up in Harlem. It must be that. But it also should be a place where the public at large, not just scholars and professional writers, can come in. And actually, I believe they should run into each other. They should see each other. I want the people in the circulating library to see the amazing work that scholars and writers are doing in the Rosemain Reading Room, in the other rooms that we want to open up, so that they will aspire to that. And I'll confess, I want the scholars and the writers to be reminded of what the true cross-section of New York looks like, because the library is the place that brings all New Yorkers and all comers together, uniquely so, in this moment in history in which society is so divided in so many ways. We have to do better with our branch libraries, the largest circulating system in the country. Yes, Mr. Carnegie envisioned and built for us fantastic facilities, and they must be maintained. But we should build on Mr. Carnegie's vision and not just be a repository where it's safe to come, use our computers, read our books, all that essential for people who do not otherwise have that access. But we should be truly the educational provider for all New Yorkers, cradle to grave, because there's no one else in that space. We are the largest provider of English language instruction in a city of immigrants. 4,000 people a year. It's shocking that that should be the largest free English language instruction in New York. We're the largest computer skills training provider in New York at a moment when those skills are essential to move in this economy. 3,000 people a year. That's shocking. We are the only place where kids feel safe to go after school, 30,000 a day. We should be providing them with the after-school support and program that will boost achievement and partner with the Department of Education to do that. And we have to be concerned about the virtual future. Today, or actually until last week, 4 of the 6 big 6 publishers in the world refuse to sell ebooks for lending to libraries. Carnegie's vision was the fundamental democratic notion that people should be able to read. If people are going to read digitally, and 2/3 of the largest publishers refuse to make that available, Carnegie's vision will end just when the technology wants it to truly take off. I'm pleased to see that one of those 4 publishers, Penguin last week, came back into the fold. We all have a responsibility to make the publishing industry understand their public interest in access to all the world's books, and then figure out through the Library of Congress, through the Digital Public Library of America, how to make those truly accessible. In effect, the public circulating library that Carnegie is famous for, that we thank him for, has to reinforce the research library. Both sides need to be strong because we need both. You cannot have a functioning economy if you do not have innovation and if you do not have people able to gather skills. And you cannot have a functioning democracy if you cannot have the citizenry able to inform itself. That is what is at risk when we are cutting libraries. When I took this job, my 16-year-old smart aleck son said to me, "Dad, you didn't get the memo that libraries are going out of business?" And indeed, he should ask. In the last 4 years alone, despite that contract with the city of New York, public funding, city funding for the New York Public Libraries has gone down 28% in 4 years. Just when we need more. As Carla described, as the economy contracts, as economic divides open, more people come to the library and depend upon it. Scholars, writers, the public at large. We live in the information age. Carnegie's vision, he understood a century in advance that actually, if libraries go out of business, America and the American dream goes out of business. And that's why we celebrate his vision and the ongoing work of the Carnegie Corporation and of so many of you here in this room today. Thanks.
The last speaker is formerly of Princeton, with whom I worked to put 2 exhibitions in the New York Public Library on French Revolution, bicentennial of French Revolution. He is an intellectual and has gone to Harvard to take some of his intellect there. They need you there. But I'm telling him, I asked him actually to talk about the role of a research library in a university such as Harvard. Afterwards, I'll be asking about digital library. Go ahead.
So I have some slides, rather facetious slides, to flash up to, it's late in the afternoon and you may need a jolt of something provocative. So here goes. I've actually been invited to defend an argument that may sound self-evident. Libraries are crucially important for research universities and for research in general. Take a tour of a typical university and you will soon get the point. The library stands at the center of the campus and it occupies a corresponding place at the heart of the university's intellectual life. It pumps intellectual energy into every sector of the university, including labs where scientists download electronic journals and databases without suspecting that they actually come from the library. At Harvard, the university owes its name to its library, a collection of 400 books left to the college in 1638 by one John Harvard. And it grew up around that original core of learning. Today, 374 years and 17 million volumes later, we recognize that the university's greatness has derived above all from the intellectual riches built up over many generations and stored in the largest library system of any university in the world. But I don't mean to indulge in institutional bragging. When librarians get together, they sometimes do that. How many volumes do you have? It's, what really counts, of course, is the quality. Instead, I would like to ask a question. Shouldn't Harvard's library and those of other research universities be considered as national assets? Shouldn't their intellectual wealth be shared? Contrary to common belief, the history of libraries does not follow an uninterrupted upward trajectory leading to the democratization of access to knowledge. From what little we know about the ancient library of Alexandria, it functioned primarily to store texts, not to make them available to readers. It admitted a few scholars, but its main purpose probably was to embody the magnificence of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Some of the libraries of ancient China accumulated books by confiscating them from private owners, destroying those that reflected badly on the current dynasty, and keeping the rest away from readers. The communist regime in Czechoslovakia used the country's libraries to purge literature rather than to preserve it. In 1954, it ordered all local librarians to cleanse their shelves of works that fit into categories that ranged from what you might expect, fascism and pornography, to the bizarre, formalism, ruralism, and snobism. They got rid of 7,500 works. The history of libraries has a dark side. The oldest libraries contributed greatly to civilization by building up their libraries, but they kept their books behind locked doors and thick walls, which removed them from outsiders. When I was a student at Oxford, the massive gate of my college slammed shut at 10 o'clock in the evening, and if you hadn't made it inside, you had to climb over one of the walls. A daunting experience, as the walls were 10 to 15 feet high and they bristled at top with spikes and shards of glass. Now, a few secret passes existed, but even they were treacherous, as you can see from this photo, which shows me posing with a friend at one of my favorite entry points, where you had to slip between rows of fixed and revolving spikes. As an accompaniment to the rest of my remarks, I will flash more pictures of Oxford's walls, which keep its libraries safe within its colleges. But actually, I want to discuss the invisible barriers to the knowledge stored in research libraries. That is, restrictive qualifications for entry, payment to obtain a reader's card, and an atmosphere of intimidation. Ordinary folk hesitate to brave these barriers. They are kept at a distance by the learned elite who wear an air of effortless superiority, which corresponds to the social sifting that the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu identified as la distinction. Oxford students captured this intellectual hauteur in verse, which they aimed at Benjamin Jowett, the master of Balliol College in the 19th century. Here come I, my name is Jowett. All there is to know, I know it. I am master of this college. What I know not is not knowledge. Maybe the Czechs were right to banish snobbery from their libraries. Well, a counter-tendency gathered force in the Age of Enlightenment when spreading light became identified with reading books. The French Royal Library began to admit readers in 1692, although not very many, and actually the librarian was supposed to give them lunch on Thursdays. There was such a thing as a free lunch, actually, in those days. The British Museum was opened to the public in 1759. In the United States, the first large public library, established in Boston in 1848, allowed any citizen to borrow books and take them home to read. The New York Public Library opened its great collections in 1911 to anyone who walked in from the street. It served as an informal university for generations of immigrants who wanted both instruction and access to the literature in their native languages. And now I come to the man whose generosity we are celebrating today, Andrew Carnegie. He financed the creation of 39 branch libraries throughout New York and also paid $40 million to build 1,697 community libraries everywhere in the country between 1886 and 1919. I hope I've got my statistics right, David, but you get the point. And it's a point made, I think, very effectively by Tony Marx. It would be misleading, however, to conclude that everyone in the United States has access to our common cultural heritage, or the bulk of it as represented by the books, prints, films, and recordings accumulated in our libraries, archives, and museums. We have only recently reached a point where this material can be made available on a grand scale, thanks to digitization and the internet. The Library of Congress showed the way with its American Memory Pilot and its plan for a national digital library, and here I take my hat off to my friend Jim Billington. But now we can go further. We have it in our power to create a digital library that will aggregate the holdings of our greatest research libraries and make them accessible to everyone free of charge. We have the funds, the technology, the know-how, and the determination to make it happen. On October 1st, 2010, a group of leaders from foundations, libraries, and computer science met at Harvard to discuss the possibility of creating a Digital Public Library of America, DPLA. The foundations would combine forces to provide the funds. The libraries would cooperate to furnish the books. We created a steering committee, a secretariat, and 6 work groups scattered across the country to tackle the most important problems. They have worked from the assumption that the DPLA will serve a very broad constituency, not just faculty in research universities, but students in community colleges, ordinary readers, K through 12 school children, seniors in retirement communities, anyone and everyone with an interest in books. We are perfecting a technical prototype which will link the holdings of many research libraries in a single interoperable distributed system. We will create a nonprofit organization in conformity with the 501c3 provision of the tax code and responsible to a board of trustees drawn from a broad range of institutions. And we are about to recruit an executive director who will set up headquarters at a location soon to be determined. Our greatest problem is the need to include works that are out of print but still covered by copyright. Copyright laws now cover everything published since 1964 and most of the works published after 1923. Now, we must respect copyright, of course, but we hope to find a way to make the oldest run of this material available, since it no longer has any value on the marketplace, but is enormously valuable to readers who want access to their cultural heritage. Meanwhile, we will bring together digitized special collections scattered through our greatest research libraries. This aggregated collection of special collections will soon be richer than anything available in one place anywhere in the world. Thomas Jefferson said, "The field of knowledge is the common property of mankind." We can realize Jefferson's vision by sharing the intellectual wealth of our research libraries, and we will begin by getting the DPLA up and running in a preliminary version 10 months from now in April 2013. Thank you.
Thank you to all the speakers. Great thanks to Jim Billington for his hospitality, to John for all the work of the Library of Congress staff. We have time only, with 10 minutes we have to go, take the buses because we're going all of us to Lincoln Memorial, where an academic procession is going to lay wreath in memory of his great acts and in gratitude of. And I was going to make the following remark, one paragraph at that occasion, but I'm prompted now to do it here. To celebrate 150th anniversary Morrill Act, National Academy of Sciences, which we'll be doing shortly, and also the libraries, reminded one thing, that Edward Everett, minister, scholar, orator, politician, president of Harvard, a leading conservative of his day, delivered a famous speech some 180 years ago. He said, there are two roads by which society can travel when it comes to the question of education. One, the route most other nations had followed, was to treat education as a luxury for a small privileged class of wealth and leisure. By that reckoning, the fortunate few would let learning creep in with luxury and dispense its blessing to those it chose worthy of the honor. They would do so out of the surplus of vast fortune. That, Everett intoned, was not the American way. The American way was to make the care of the mind from the outset a part of its public economy, growth of knowledge a portion of its public wealth. And that's why we're here today. 150 years of commitment to public good and also to democracy. So I'd like to congratulate all of you for the 150th anniversary of Morrill Act, but also National Academy of Sciences, and the early librarians who are going to be here whether you like it or not, because as David Nasaw says, somebody has to interpret. Now, the other thing is inexcusable, because for the first time in world history, every individual is going to have their Library of Alexandria. Just think of it, every individual. But having it and using properly is the issue question of education. Because as Thoreau, or I think Mark Twain said, when Maine was connected telegraphically with San Francisco, he said, Maine has been connected to San Francisco, and Maine has nothing to say to San Francisco. Because we have put so much attention on technology connectivity that we don't know connection must have also a content. And content requires skill education. So Jim Billington's brilliance of bringing the laboratory, the classroom, and the library together to complement and strengthen our democracy was a great idea. With that, I think if you have one question, I can ask. If not, let's stop here, give a big cheer to all of them with our gratitude for guarding the libraries of our country and the world.
say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming.
Good afternoon. This is the closing event of an all-day conference at the Library of Congress celebrating the creation of a dynamic, knowledge-based democracy and organized by the Library of Congress and the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Thanks to the Carnegie Corporation of New York and its president, Vartan Gregorian, and the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities and the National Academy of Science. Thanks to them all. The underpinnings of American democracy, American prosperity, and American international influence in and beyond the 20th century was established in large measure by a visionary group of leaders just a century ago who formed, a century and a half ago to be exact, who formed libraries, universities, and scientific institutions that laid the basis for our unique and dynamic knowledge-based democracy. These leaders included Justin Morrill, the congressman and later senator from Vermont, who was responsible for the Morrill Act establishing the system of land-grant universities, which we are celebrating on this 150th anniversary of its passage. And also Andrew Carnegie, the immigrant businessman and philanthropist who funded the building of more than 1,600 public libraries in cities and towns throughout America. These men were committed to learning and knowledge that should be shared, and they felt would be shared as widely as possible for the benefit of a productive and democratically engaged population. We are here at this marvelous Lincoln Memorial to honor the great leader who is best known for preserving the Union and the Emancipation Proclamation and the abolition of slavery, all of this in wartime, but he was also deeply committed to education, science, and the welfare of the American people. On July 2nd, 1862, at the height of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln signed into law the Morrill Act, creating the land-grant universities. The following year, he signed legislation creating the National Academy of Sciences. He also signed into law both the Homestead Act that granted massive federal funds to small farmers and the bill that chartered the first transcontinental railroad. The inscription in this memorial behind us reads, "In this temple, as in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever." On this particular occasion, we are gathered to remember and honor him for his vision in joining with Justin Morrill at a time of deep national crisis to look beyond the dark early days of our Civil War and to create the basis for prosperity and democracy that we still enjoy today and have a continuing responsibility to preserve and enhance for future generations. Thank you all for coming. And now I want to present to you and bring to the podium the Honorable Richard W. Riley, who was U.S. Secretary of Education under President Clinton from 1993 to 2001, and then was as governor of South Carolina from 1978 to 1987. He's a former trustee and vice chairman of the board of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and a distinguished spokesman who has seen much of and helped much of this glorious tribute that we are trying to pay to our knowledge-based democracy and those who created it. Ladies and gentlemen, Secretary Governor Riley.
Thank you so much, Jim, and I take pleasure in joining with all of you to celebrate this legacy to President Abraham Lincoln and Senator Justin Morrill. I'm sorry you all are in the sun and we're in the shade, so you raise your hand if you want us to speed up. These two gentlemen, though, helped to create really a system of higher education that democratized opportunity for Americans from all walks of life in every corner of our nation. It's not surprising that in the midst of the Civil War, President Lincoln dedicated himself to this very important cause, just as he had a vision of a nation that would be reunited and renewed strength together. He also believed that the key to promising future was education. He proclaimed in 1832, and note this is 3 decades before he signed the Morrill Land Grant College Act. Upon the subject of education, he said, I can only say that I view it as the most important subject which we as a people can be engaged. As a father and a grandfather and a former governor and secretary of education, I certainly strongly agree with President Lincoln, as all of you do here. Advanced education favorably impacts the lives of individual men and women, and therefore the strength of our democracy and the progress of our nation. Indeed, some things that happened after this event that were involvement of a very important matter in 1944. The GI Bill was signed, Roosevelt was going out, Truman was coming in. And as we well know, that law provided over 2 million returning veterans a passport to the American middle class. I was one of those veterans coming out of the Navy and going to law school, and I know all of you appreciate that great act. In more recent times, this grand tradition of moving America forward by advancing education has been carried on by President Eisenhower's National Defense Student Loan Act in '58, and then, of course, President Lyndon Johnson's signing of the Higher Education Act in 1965. So that's another part of our history. It's a wonderful history where we've seen education play a critical role in helping our nation move forward. In that regard, I would also point out that America's spirit of optimism, of moving forward into a future together, has always been linked to the advance of education, always. Today, our nation is confronted with the need to train and educate our future leaders and thinkers who can keep America competitive in this globalized, knowledge-based economy of the 21st century. So I think we have a special obligation in the spirit of bipartisanship to rekindle this feeling of optimism that has linked to education. In pursuit of that request, let us remember that we are not educating our young people as Republicans or Democrats or independents. We are educating them as Americans, whose task, I think and I hope, whose joy will be to create happy and successful and productive lives for themselves. In addition, we must teach them to be thoughtful and creative, dedicated and caring stewards of our great nation, a nation that those who went before us have bequeathed to us and those who follow after us will inherit. I believe, as I'm sure all of you believe with me, that we can join together as a nation and as a people to invest in higher education. We must widen access to our colleges and universities, address the problem of affordability, and deal with the many other issues that face our higher education institutions and also face our students, our faculty, our parents, and every other person who loves our nation and cares about its future. I tell you, we can find a solution to these challenges if, and only if, we work together. President Lincoln believed that the American people would always have the faith and the strength to do just that. Today and in years to come, I hope it will be the goal of all Americans to prove that he was right. And I thank you very much for the chance to be with you, and it's now my great pleasure to introduce a wonderful friend of mine and an education colleague, Dr. Peter McPherson, the president of the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities. Peter?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I will be brief in the spirit of all you being the sun. Lincoln had this vision the Secretary spoke of higher education and economic mobility for the sons and daughters of ordinary people. His land-grant colleges were to teach scientific agriculture, mechanical arts, later engineering, and humanities. The Morrill Act was a democratization of higher education. It was in that spirit that so much of public education, higher education, was impacted by the Act in generations that follow. There are now 50 land-grant universities in all 50 states, D.C., and the territories, including the colleges and universities added in 1890 and 1994. There are 7 million students at public universities in this country, an increase of 23% enrollment over only a decade. Public universities do 60% of the research that's funded by the federal government, a figure that often surprises people. I think President Lincoln will be pleased at his legacy. And of course, it's a legacy that we need to continue to expand and live up to. We need to, as public institutions, as institutions with a public purpose, provide high-quality education, do the research that is such an important part of the nation's future. We can do this, but we need, of course, a renewed partnership with states, continued partnership with the federal government, as well as many other parties. It's interesting to look at the history of higher education and research dollars. By and large, this has been more of a bipartisan issue than almost anything, any major sector. And even as the Hill discusses what to do about the student loan interest rates, everybody agrees that something has to be done with them. It's in that spirit that a bipartisanship that we need to build, because the 21st century has to have strong, democratized higher education for this country. And my next role here is the pleasure of introducing Ralph Cicerone, who is the president of the National Academies of Sciences who runs an institution that Lincoln also supported with his colleagues. And Ralph, thank you for all the good work you do, and I know we all welcome you here today.
Well, good afternoon. As the director of the Library of Congress, James Billington, said earlier, the National Academy of Sciences was created in the middle of the Civil War, 1863. The idea was to prepare for the future, to create an infrastructure for the development of the United States based on science, and also to provide opportunities for our people, and eventually to become a world leader. And I believe it has worked. The Academy was created not as a part of government, but as a private, nonprofit organization whose primary mission would be to serve the federal government on request. We take that obligation and opportunity very seriously. We are nonpartisan. We try extremely hard to avoid the politics that might otherwise interfere with objective and rational analysis. I'm so enthusiastic about being here today because to think of all these marvelous acts of courage and leadership and vision that occurred during the middle of the Civil War to create the capacity in these public land-grant universities for democratization of the United States and a well-informed citizenry who would be prepared for the future, along with the National Academy of Sciences, was an amazing set of acts, which we celebrate too infrequently. So to gather here today at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial is not only appropriate, it's quite inspiring. It's something that I think all of us should remember, and remember with it that our obligation and our opportunity is to think about the future and to maintain these institutions and to make them accessible and available to all citizens for the benefit of the United States and for world leadership. It's out of respect and commitment to those future goals that I think all of us are here today with quite a bit of enthusiasm. I'd like to turn now to introduce the next speaker, who's a hero to all of us, Professor Vartan Gregorian. Dr. Gregorian is the president of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which is Andrew Carnegie's foundation, created 100 years ago to do marvelous things which it has done. Dr. Gregorian, as the director of the New York Public Library previously and as president of a major U.S. university, has set an example on advancing democracy and advancing education at all levels, including higher education. So it's a great honor to introduce, if only briefly, Dr. Vartan Gregorian.
Good afternoon. I don't believe in seances, but with your kind permission, I'm going to turn a little left and talk to President Lincoln, because that's why we're here. So I hope wherever he is, he'll hear this. You gave us a land of opportunity, not land of opportunists. You believed America to be not perfect, but perfectible, yet perfectible. And you democratized knowledge and access to higher education. So millions of Americans today are grateful to you for giving them a chance to participate in the American dream and to become free citizens of this great country. So on behalf of all the education leaders here, heads of associations and scientific community, land-grant universities, as well as National Academy of Sciences, I would like to present you our profound thanks and gratitude, because we need leaders like you more than once a century. So thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for everything you've done.
Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the wreath laying by U.S. Army Corporal Zach Faulkner, commemorating the leadership and vision of President Abraham Lincoln in a time of national crisis.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.